Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep, really deep, into British rule in India.
Governors General, the folks who ran the show.
Yeah, and this is perfect for history buffs, but especially if you're prepping for those UPSC exams, that GS1 Modern Indian History section.
Oh, this stuff is gold for that.
Absolutely. So if you want to ace those exams, stick with
Or
it.
if you just want to know more about India's past, you're in the right place.
Hit that like button, subscribe, and ding that notification bell so you don't miss our deep dives. All right, let's jump in. We're not just going to list names and dates. We're going beyond that.
We got to understand why these guys made the decisions they did. What impact did it have back then?
And what can we still see in India today?
Yeah.
Echoes of their actions.
Imagine you're looking at a building, right? You can admire it from the outside, but knowing the architect's vision, that gives you a whole new level of appreciation.
Love that analogy. Okay, so even before we get to the official governors general, there's this one guy, Robert Clive.
Oh, Clive. He was operating before the title Governor General even existed.
Right. But his actions really set the stage. He kind of laid the groundwork.
Totally. He helped the East India Company get a foothold, but he also saw how corrupt the company itself was, and he tried to fix it. Pretty bold for the time.
He banned private trade for the company employees. Like, hey, you're here to work for the company, not line your own pockets.
Mm?
And he stopped all those fancy gifts Indian rulers would give company officials.
Oh, yeah, those gifts. They were definitely influencing business decisions, let's just say that.
For sure. So Clive's reforms, they were big, but they also make you wonder, what were his motives?
Take the Society of Trade he set up in 1765. Was it really about stopping corruption, or was it just another way to grab more control? Historians are still arguing about this.
It's like a historical puzzle. What was Clive really up to? And that kind of complexity is something we'll see with a lot of these governors general.
Yeah, were they good guys, bad guys, or somewhere in between? Hard to say sometimes.
Okay, so before we get too deep into the individuals, we've got to understand how the title evolved. It shows how the British gained more and more power.
Started with Governor of Bengal, then became Governor General of Bengal with that Regulating Act of 1773.
Right, like leveling up in a video game. More power, more territory, more influence.
Exactly. And finally, by 1833, boom, they become Governor General of India.
That's a big shift, right? It shows they're centralizing their control over the whole subcontinent.
The beginning of the British Raj, from the East India Company to direct rule under the British Crown.
All right, so our first official Governor General of Bengal, drumroll please, Warren Hastings, served from 1773 to 1785.
Hastings and Clive, they really laid the foundation for British dominance. But their methods, let's just say they were controversial.
They built an empire, but at what cost? That's a question that keeps popping up.
Definitely. All right, next up, Lord Cornwallis, 1786 to 1793. Isn't it funny how he surrendered to the Americans in their revolution and then comes over to India to help solidify British control?
It's kind of ironic, right?
Yeah. But Cornwallis was all about structure and efficiency. He established the Cornwallis Code, which brought some pretty radical ideas for the time. Like, he insisted on merit-based appointments for government positions.
So no more playing favorites.
Exactly. And guess what? That paved the way for the Indian civil service, a huge part of British administration in India.
Wow. So he was bringing in some modern ideas about, like, bureaucracy and meritocracy. Pretty significant.
Oh, yeah. And his code also separated the powers of government, the executive, judicial, and revenue branches. Sounds familiar, right?
Like checks and balances.
Exactly. A fundamental principle in many democracies today.
Okay, and when we talk Cornwallis, we got to talk about the permanent settlement. This system basically made landlords, well, permanent owners of the land.
Huge impact on land ownership and agriculture in India, and it's still debated today.
Yeah, did it create stability or lead to exploitation? Tough question.
For sure.
And it's interesting. The next Governor General, Sir John Shore, he was not a fan of that permanent settlement.
Nope, thought Cornwallis rushed it. He wanted more data, a slower, more cautious approach. Different personalities, different styles.
Okay, buckle up for this one. Our next Governor General is Lord Arthur Wellesley, served 1798 to 1805. Later on, he became the Duke of Wellington, the guy who defeated Napoleon.
Wellesley was a brilliant military mind. He led the British to victory in the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War against Tipu Sultan, and he was key in the Second Anglo-Maratha War.
So this guy was playing on the world stage. And in India, he's known for his subsidiary alliance policy, a way to expand British influence without directly conquering.
Super clever. Indian rulers kept their titles, but they couldn't make alliances with other powers. They had to have a British resident at their court, and they had to pay for British troops stationed on their land.
Basically giving the British a ton of control without the hassle of actually running the place day to day. Makes you wonder if those Indian rulers fully understood what they were getting into.
Right. Were they really in control or just puppets?
Let's touch on Lord George Barlow quickly. He was acting Governor General from 1805 to 1807. Then Lord Minto V from 1807 to 1813. He's known for the Treaty of Amritsar, keeping things peaceful with Ranjit Singh, the powerful Sikh ruler.
Smart move, securing the border so they could focus on other things.
Strategic. Now on to Francis Rawdon Hastings, also known as Lord Hastings, from 1813 to 1823. Lots of wars during this time. Anglo-Nepalese War, Third Anglo-Maratha War.
Big changes. The Sugali Treaty after the Anglo-Nepalese War gave the British a lot of Nepalese territory. And that Third Anglo-Maratha War basically ended the Maratha Confederacy for good. British power was growing.
Hastings introduced the policy of paramountcy, basically saying, hey, we're the top dogs now. We can intervene wherever we want.
It wasn't just about military power either. They really thought they were bringing civilization and progress to India.
Right, that whole idea that they were the modernizing force.
Yep, but of course that ignored India's own rich traditions.
Okay, Lord Amherst, our next Governor General, served 1823 to 1828. He had to deal with the First Anglo-Burmese War.
That ended with the Treaty of Yandabu, expanding their influence into Burma, which we now call Myanmar.
Right. But Amherst also had to deal with the Barrackpore Mutiny in 1824. Remember that?
Indian soldiers refused to use those new rifle cartridges. They were rumored to be greased with animal fat, went against their religion.
Big problem. Even though it was put down quickly, it showed that there was serious discontent brewing, a sign of things to come.
Foreshadowing the bigger revolt in 1857. All right, now we come to a major turning point. 1833. The Charter Act changes the title officially to Governor General of India, and no more East India Company monopoly on trade.
This is huge. The British Raj, for real this time.
Direct control from the British government. Big shift in power.
And our first Governor General of India under this new system is Lord William Bentinck. He was in office from 1828 to 1835. He's known for his social reform.
Big-time reformer, yeah.
Tell us more.
Well, he's most famous for abolishing sati in 1829, that practice of widow burning. He also fought against female infanticide and really pushed English education in India. Progressive for the time, definitely.
But were his motives pure? Or was it also about imposing British culture? It's hard to know sometimes.
It's a debate historians still have. Did he help Indians, or was it a form of control?
It's tricky. Okay, next we have a guy who didn't serve very long, Sir Charles Metcalfe, 1835 to 1836. He's called the liberator of the Indian press.
He got rid of those restrictive press laws.
So, more freedom of speech. Interesting.
Well, it reflected a changing political scene both in Britain and India. More people were demanding free speech.
But I bet it wasn't total freedom.
Oh, definitely not. Still, lots of limits on what you could say. Progress isn't always a straight line.
Makes sense. Okay, let's briefly mention Lord Auckland from 1836 to 1842 and Lord Ellenborough, who was in office from 1842 to 1844.
Auckland's got that first Anglo-Afghan war hanging over him. A real disaster, that one. Showed the limits of British power.
Yeah, and Ellenborough, successful in some military stuff, but controversial. Made a lot of enemies.
Not all governors general were great leaders or even good people. They made mistakes, had their own agendas.
That's for sure. Now, for two guys who were key players in the lead up to the 1857 revolt, Lord Hardinge I, who served from 1844 to 1848, and Lord Dalhousie from 1848 to 1856.
Hardinge, I was involved in that first Anglo-Sikh war, which led to the annexation of Punjab.
But Dalhousie, he's the one who really stands out, right?
Absolutely. Modernizer, consolidator of British power, and a really controversial figure.
He modernized the infrastructure. Railways, telegraph lines, unified postal system, all those things.
But some people saw those things as just another way for the British to tighten their grip on India.
Right, that double-edged sword of progress and control. And then there's that whole doctrine of lapse thing.
Yeah, that was a big one. Basically, if an Indian ruler died without a natural heir, the British could just annex their state.
Seemed like a straight-up land grab to a lot of Indians.
Oh, it was. And it caused a lot of resentment, especially when they annexed Oudh, a large and wealthy kingdom.
That was a major factor leading up to the 1857 revolt, right?
Absolutely. A seemingly boring policy with huge consequences.
Wow. So Dalhousie, he's a complex character. On one hand, pushing India forward, but also pushing it towards rebellion.
Full of contradictions, like a lot of British rule at that time, progress and exploitation all mixed up.
Yeah, makes you think. History's rarely simple, is it?
Not at all. These guys were operating in a really complicated situation with conflicting interests and ideologies. They made decisions that shaped India, but they also made mistakes, had biases, and left behind a legacy that we're still figuring out today.
That's what makes studying this period so fascinating, right? Trying to make sense of it all.
Absolutely. Welcome back to the deep dive. Last time, we got to know some of those big names in British India, the governors general.
Yeah, it was like a who's who of British rule. But today, we're going deeper.
We're going to see how British rule actually affected everyday people in India.
Right, like what was life really like back then? Not just for the guys in charge.
Exactly. Think of it like this. India's a giant tapestry.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Those governors general, they're the big, bold threads. But today we're looking at all those smaller threads, the ones that make up the whole picture.
I get it. The details, the everyday lives of people.
Yep. Their struggles, their hopes, how they resisted. So let's start with the economy. British rule changed how Indians made a living, one of the biggest changes. The shift from a mostly agrarian economy to one tied to the global market.
So instead of just farming for their own communities, people were producing stuff to ship off to Britain.
Right. India became a giant supplier of raw materials. Cotton, indigo, tea, you name it.
I bet that created some opportunities, but also some problems.
Well, for sure. It was good for some, but traditional industries suffered. Like all those artisans and craftspeople, they were being replaced.
And I imagine this created inequality, right?
Definitely. British policies favored certain groups, leading to more wealth and power for a few and less for everyone else, led to a lot of tension.
Makes sense. Okay, so beyond the economy, what about society and culture? How did British rule affect that?
It had a huge impact. Western education, Christianity, they even tried to impose British laws and customs on India.
So basically you had two Indias developing at the same time, one modernizing, one holding on to traditional values.
Exactly. And this clash between tradition and modernity led to new movements, religious ones, social ones. You even saw it reflected in Indian art and literature.
It's amazing how resilient Indian culture was, even under colonial rule. It found ways to adapt, to resist, to express itself.
It really is. Speaking of resilience, let's talk about politics. The British brought in their own systems of government, set up legislative councils, even started expanding voting rights.
So were they trying to create a democracy? Or were they just trying to hold on to power?
It was both, really. They weren't ready to give up control, and they definitely used those divide and rule tactics. But the seeds of democracy were planted.
And those seeds would eventually grow into an independent India. Pretty incredible when you think about it.
It is. Now, let's flip the script for a second and think about the British experience in India. How did living in such a different place change them?
Oh, I bet it was a huge culture shock. New climate, new languages, new everything.
It was a big adjustment. Some officials developed a real respect for Indian culture. Others, not so much. They saw India as backwards, uncivilized. They thought they were doing India a favor by ruling it.
So a real mix of views, huh? I wonder how those different views affected their interactions with Indians, the policies they made.
They definitely had an influence, and they also shaped how people back in Britain saw India. Often it was a pretty distorted view.
Fascinating. Okay, now let's talk about Indian women specifically. I bet their experience under British rule was different from men's.
Definitely. And British policies had a huge impact on their lives. On the positive side, they outlawed sati and made widow remarriage legal.
Those were big steps forward for women's rights.
We were, but there were downsides too. British policies also pushed women into lower-paying jobs, often in agriculture, and Western education mostly benefited men.
So progress in some areas, but not in others.
Yeah, sadly. But remember, women weren't just sitting back and taking it. They were resisting, adapting, finding ways to assert themselves.
Right, they were making their own choices as much as they could.
Exactly. They educated their daughters, joined movements, even took on leadership roles.
Those stories often get lost, don't they? The everyday heroes.
They do. Okay, let's take a step back and consider the big picture. How does British rule still affect India today, both the good and the bad?
It's amazing to think the decisions made centuries ago still matter.
They do. On the plus side, the British built infrastructure. Railways, postal systems, universities, all those things helped India develop and are still important today.
Yeah, that's a lasting impact for sure. But there must be downsides too, right?
Unfortunately, yes. British economic policies really hurt India in the long run. They exploited resources and prevented India from developing its own industries. And their divide and rule tactics created tensions that still exist today.
It shows how colonialism's effects last long after the rulers are gone.
That's why understanding this period is so crucial. It's not just about the past, it's about understanding the present and shaping the future.
Okay, before we move on, we got to talk about resistance. Did Indians just accept British rule, or did they fight back?
They absolutely fought back in all kinds of ways: armed rebellions, nonviolent movements, religious revivals, cultural expressions. They were determined to challenge British authority and hold on to their identity.
What are some examples? We talked about the 1857 revolt, but what else was going on?
There were tons of uprisings and rebellions led by local chiefs, religious figures, even farmers. They might have been crushed, but they showed that the spirit of resistance was strong.
It's inspiring to think about people fighting back, even when the odds were stacked against them.
It is. And don't forget about the nonviolent resistance. That became really important later on.
Like Gandhi.
Exactly. Those mass movements that used boycotts, strikes, civil disobedience, they were incredibly effective.
And eventually, they led to India's independence.
Right. But resistance wasn't always so dramatic. Sometimes it was just about holding on to your culture.
Like a quiet kind of resistance.
Yeah. Wearing your traditional clothes, speaking your language, celebrating your festivals, even when the British tried to discourage it.
It's like saying, you can control our land, but you can't control who we are.
Exactly. And that was so important for maintaining community and pride.
It's amazing how strong Indian culture was, how it adapted and resisted.
It really is. So we've seen how British rule affected people's lives, their society, their culture. We've seen how they resisted.
It's been a really eye-opening journey so far. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've talked about governors general, the big picture of British rule in India. We've talked about how it affected everyday folks.
But now it's time to really zoom in, to hear the stories of individuals who lived through it all.
Yeah, let's get personal, meet some real people from British India.
Imagine walking through a busy market in, say, Bengal. You might bump into a farmer. He's having a tough time. That permanent settlement, not working out so well for him.
Yeah, we talked about that policy. But hearing it from someone actually living it,
Yeah.
that would make it real.
He'd tell you how his family used to own their land, but now they just rent it. The landlord's miles away, doesn't care about them, just wants his money.
It's easy to talk about policies, but this is about real lives.
Exactly. Keep walking through that market and you might meet a weaver. His hands are rough from years at the loom. He'll tell you about his family's tradition, making beautiful silk.
Generations of it, I bet.
But now it's getting harder. Those cheap British textiles are everywhere.
It's sad how colonialism could just wipe out these traditions.
All right, let's get out of the city. Head into the countryside. You might run into a tribal leader. He's fighting to protect his people's land, their customs.
That clash between colonialism and these ancient ways of life
Yeah.
must have been so hard.
He could tell you stories about sacred forests, rituals, a whole way of life that's fading away.
Now imagine we're in a big port city, like Calcutta. We meet a young student. He's excited about the new ideas he's learning in school, all that Western education.
He's dreaming of a modern India, an independent India.
A place where Indians are in charge. It's interesting how colonialism brought these new ideas, but also this desire for freedom.
It did. Okay, let's not forget about the British side of things. Imagine a young British official just arrived in India.
Fresh off the boat.
He's probably a mix of excited and overwhelmed. It's a whole new world, right?
I bet. I wonder what these officials really thought about India, how their time here changed them.
It's a good question. You see, these individual stories, they paint a more complete picture of British India. It's not just about dates and events. It's about people's lives, their hopes, their struggles.
Makes it all so much more real, so much more human.
It does. Now, before we wrap up, let's go back to that idea of resistance. We talked about rebellions, about Gandhi, but resistance wasn't always so obvious.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. Choosing to wear traditional clothes instead of British fashion, speaking your own language, even when they pushed you to learn English.
Holding on to your culture.
Exactly. Keeping your traditions alive, even when they tried to stamp them out. It was a way of saying, we're still here.
A quiet form of rebellion.
It was. And it helped people maintain their identity, their pride, during a really tough time.
And in the end, those small acts of resistance, along with the bigger ones, helped lead to India's independence.
That's right. So as you continue learning about this period, remember to look for those hidden stories, to hear the voices of those who weren't in power.
There's always more to discover.
Right, always. History's a conversation that never really ends. And for those of you studying for the UPSC exams, remember, it's not just about memorizing facts, it's about understanding the complexity, the nuances of this era.
Exactly. It's about WHY, things happened, not just what happened.
Well said. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into British rule in India.
Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep exploring history.
Thanks for joining.